right, so let's go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome to our panel on 9/11. It is the anniversary today of 9/11, so very important topic, and we will get into questions and talking about that day and reactions to that day in just a moment. But first, I would like to introduce our president, campus president, Dr. Jan Clayton, who is going to give some brief opening remarks. So Dr. Clayton.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, excellent. So I am Dr. Jan Clayton, and I proudly serve as your interim campus president. Wanted to take the opportunity to introduce a couple of other administrators in the room. We have with us today Dr. Michael DuPont, who is serving as the interim vice president for student affairs. I am not sure if Dr. Ann Sorge is going to be able to join us. And then we have Marjorie Curtis, who is our coordinator of academic affairs. And I'm looking around, I want to make sure I don't miss any of our deans. And then we have our amazing faculty in our program chairs here. If you're a faculty or a program chair, do you mind raising your hand so our students can see you? Excellent. Okay. And I want to just thank the Social and Human Sciences Division who have organized, that's right, ooh, I like that, who have organized this important program, which gives us the opportunity to remember and reflect on the events of September the 11th, 2001, and better understand how that day did and how that day does continue to define us as a nation. We are going to hear and learn from an outstanding panel of faculty scholars who will help to examine this significant event through cultural, social, psychological, and historical lenses and perspectives. I was in an exceptionally good mood the morning of September the 11th, 2001. Like today, it was my birthday. And my husband and I have plans to celebrate that evening. I was feeling grateful for another year of life, and I had already received several calls from family and friends before I left our house for work. I worked for the Dean of Student Affairs at a university in Oklahoma. I entered the first floor of the administrative building where we officed, and I noticed that the bank of televisions by the welcome desk in the lobby had live breaking news banners scrolling. I paused to watch the screens, but because there was no sound, I decided to go upstairs to my office and turn on the television in my boss's office. As I entered the suite, I told other staff they should join me in his office because something was going on. It was a typical thing that we would do, but we had no idea how different this impromptu gathering would be. Our small group assembled around the conference table, and we started watching CNN. There was a small plume of smoke coming from one of the World Trade Center towers, and the news commentary was suggesting that a small plane had possibly veered off course and accidentally struck the building. We switched through a few channels, and we noticed that all the outlets were covering this story. And then, to our horror, we watched real time as a large plane hit the south tower of the World Trade Center at 9:03 a.m. in New York, which was 8:03 a.m. for those of us in a central time zone. The image looked surreal. And as we considered how a commercial airplane could get off track and hit a skyscraper in lower Manhattan, news reports stated that something had happened at the Pentagon. The tone of the news coverage started to change, and terrorism as a theme became the narrative. Then the absolute worst began to happen right before our eyes. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, followed about 30 minutes later by the North Tower. We were simply stunned. Some on our team cried. I think I did as well, but I can't remember those specifics. What I can recall are the sensory memories I felt, which included feelings of extreme sorrow, anger, fear, and confusion. Yet in the midst of this incomprehensible tragedy came moments of profound connection and a shared national grief. American author and monk Thomas Merton once noted, "We are already one, but we imagine we are not. And what we have to recover is our original unity. What we have to be is what we are." Our American heartache and our pain bound us together, and it reminded us we are interconnected as a community. Our shared outrage was not attached to partisan ideologies like political parties or sectionalism beliefs such as one state is better than another. In fact, our pain was shared with people around the world. And our desire to do something to serve and support those who had lost the most became a unified national priority. There are many legacies and lessons from 9/11. One of the most powerful is a reminder that we have the capacity to transcend differences and challenges to achieve a greater good. I challenge you today to actively listen, to consider varied perspectives, to be thoughtful in your analysis, and fully engage with your faculty and your peers in this important discussion. I'll now turn it over to our esteemed panel.
Hot mic. So first I'd like to introduce the panel. My name is Sara Reed. I teach history here at the Northeast campus. I'll be the moderator of the panel. To my left is Dr. Karen Wisely. She teaches history at the Northeast campus as well. To her left is Cheryl North, who teaches sociology. To her left, Angela Shindoll, who teaches mental health. And to her left, Vanessa Steinkamp, who teaches government. And Dr. Clayton, I want to thank you for sharing your experience on 9/11, and I'd actually like to begin the panel by getting the experiences of our panelists. What were they doing when 9/11 happens? Because it's one of those events that you always remember exactly what you were doing that day. So Dr. Wisely, would you like to begin?
Yeah. Here, turning off a couple of those would work. I was working at Boeing in North Dallas on the morning of 9/11, and we worked 7 to 3:30, and I was at my station with my headset on, my headphones on, listening to the Kid Craddock in the Morning show, and they talked about the plane, the first plane hitting the building, and as Dr. Clayton mentioned, they thought it was a small private jet, that it wasn't a big deal, and there were actually, a lot of jokes and things being thrown around, like, hey, how do you not notice a 110-story building? What's going on, and then the second plane hit, and there was an immediate change of tone. And immediately, myself and my teammates at work, we were, talking in hushed tones. We wanted to go to the break room and see what was going on the TV, but we did not have break until 9 o'clock. And so we rushed out to the room, the break room, and I was standing there talking to two friends when I watched the first tower fall. And I was watching the TV and they were talking, and I was like, guys, something just happened. And they were like, what are you talking about? And I was like, it just fell. And they were like, no, that can't happen. And it did. And then our boss came in and snapped off the TVs and said, get back to work. And we weren't allowed to watch any more of it all day until we got out of work at 3:30. And then I rushed home and turned on the TV and tried to frantically to catch up with everything that had happened during the day. That was my experience. So I didn't get to see a whole lot of what happened. I'm a historian, and I've always kind of been a historian in my mind and in my heart. And when something big happens, I want to park myself in front of the TV and not leave it until I understand what's going on. And I was denied that on 9/11, and I've been trying to frantically find out more about it ever since then, I think.
Thank you. Cheryl.
I'm actually, can you hear me? I'm actually almost the exact opposite of that. I was almost stuck in front of the TV the whole day that it happened because I was in the hospital when this happened. I had just given birth to my son the day before. And so I remember waking up in the hospital and it just felt wrong. You could hear people crying in the hallways, and all the phones were down. None of the phones were working. So I turned on the television and watched it unfold just minute by minute, and the commentary and the confusion. It was a really confusing day, upsetting. And when you're in the hospital for any reason, you feel kind of not in control of your own destiny anyway. You feel like control even of yourself has been taken out of your hands. And so I just remember it being a really chaotic time. People were afraid, people were upset, people were greatly saddened, and it was it weighed really heavy on me being stuck in that hospital bed and watching it unfold like it did all day long.
So I was teaching at a school in Highland Park for children with dyslexia and dysgraphia, and I remember vividly driving along Mockingbird on my way there, and I had a 4-week-old in the back seat and a 5-year-old who was going to kindergarten, and I was getting ready to drop them off, and I heard on the radio on the way to work, just like Dr. Wisely did, that something had happened with the World Trade Center. They weren't sure what yet, but they said just keep your signals open so that you can hear from us. And of course, I'm going in to teach, and there's children everywhere, and we are to protect them. And at the same time, I'm taking my kids off to drop them off. And as a parent and an instructor, that's a heavy weight that you carry. So I walked in, dropped mine off, and then I went on down to the hallway where I taught. And they said, make sure that there are no screens on for the children today. None. And I was like, okay, well, what's happened? And they said, well, it's something significant and we don't know what. So when it was time for me to take my group to PE, I took them down there, and the coach had a room where he had taken the TV. He said, you've got to come in and see this. Because now I've not heard anything really except for that one radio snippet. And I said, what are we looking at? He said, just keep the kids out there with this other instructor. So I went in with him, and all we could see was both of the towers had fallen at that point, because this is about midway through the day. And I remember them saying to us, we cannot let the children know any of this. This is up to their parents. We can't give any announcements. We don't want to create fear. We want to keep a measure of calm. So as a teacher, as an instructor, even now, when you hear those types of things in a crisis situation, you've got to pull from every resource you have and keep yourself at a level place, because if anyone feels any anxiety from you, it just kind of ripples through. So we kept things as much as normal as possible for our children, and that was quite a significant event that day. And as soon as we got home, of course, we were all hearing the updates all day long and into the next few days. So it's quite significant.
It's funny, just even think, yours is off. I think mine is the, okay. It's funny, just even thinking about it has my heart pounding. I was a second-year high school AP Gov teacher, and I had first hour off. So I was sitting in my office, and the TV's playing in the background, and the first plane hits. My secretary comes in from the office around and goes, "Did you see that?" I was like, "Yeah." We kind of chat about it. She leaves. I'm sitting in there. I have 5 minutes till my second hour class starts. Second plane hits. Two of my best friends from college live in New York. I'm frantically trying to call them. One ran across the Brooklyn Bridge after it happened. If you knew her, that was a feat in itself. I had not seen her run ever before. They were frantic. I had to leave after talking to them to go into class with a group of senior AP Gov students who knew what was going on, and we were supposed to have a test that day. And I decided very calmly we're not having a test. And these were kids that understood. Throughout that first period, we kept having the deans come in to pull kids out because we had students whose parents worked at Cantor Fitzgerald, were pilots, and they had no idea what was going on. So I had to turn on the TV to keep them apprised of what was going on, but I had to filter it through them, like you said, to keep their anxiety down, but also make sure they were informed. These were kids on the cusp of suffrage. Some of them were already 18 and sovereign, and I was the conduit that was providing this information all day long. It was exhausting. It was, I mean, I can still almost get tears. And that drive home was eerily quiet, and I finally got to process what was going on. And still, so many years later, it affects me.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. I'll briefly share mine. I was a senior in college, and I was in the library, of course I was in the library. And I was walking out of the library to go to class, and one of my friends rushed up to me and said, "A plane has hit the World Trade Center." And I was like, how do you not see the World Trade Center? At first I thought it had been an accident. She said, no, it was on purpose. And so I was going to history class, get there, and my history professor comes in and says, "No, this is history. You need to be in front of a television." So I spent the entire day in front of the television, watching every event unfold in horror. So, what I'd like to do now is to get Dr. Wisely to give a brief sort of rundown of the history. She has a PowerPoint that she's going to show you, and then we'll get into the questions.
Okay. Good afternoon. For those of us who lived through that day, it's wild to think that most of you don't even remember it. And quite a few of our students these days weren't even alive when the towers went down. For that reason, here's a sort of overview. Next slide. September 11th, 2001 began as a normal, clear Tuesday morning in New York City. The big stories of the day were, one, it was primary day in New York City where they were going to be choosing a new mayor. And two, rumors that Michael Jordan was coming back to the NBA, but probably not with the Bulls. And three, the New York Giants had lost their home opener to the Denver Broncos on Monday Night Football the night before. The game ended late, and a lot of people were getting a late start to their mornings. Some of them would survive because of it. Next slide. At 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time, a plane crashes into One World Trade Center, the North Tower. The impact left a gaping, burning hole between the 93rd and the 99th floors of the 110-story skyscraper, instantly killing the 76 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board American Airlines Flight 11, and hundreds inside the buildings, and trapping hundreds more in the floors above the impact. Next slide. Within less than 10 minutes, President George W. Bush, who was attending an event at a Florida elementary school, was informed of the crash, which at that point was characterized as an accident. Next slide. 9:03 a.m. Eastern Time. By now, literally every news agency on television was running a live shot of the North Tower billowing smoke over the city. So millions of Americans witnessed a second airplane make a sharp turn towards 2 World Trade Center, the South Tower. The collision between the 77th and 85th floors of the 110-story building caused a massive explosion that showered burning debris over surrounding buildings and onto the streets below. The 51 passengers, 9 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board United Airlines Flight 175 were killed instantly, along with an undetermined number of people inside the building. Next slide. It was now apparent that the United States was under attack. President Bush was informed of the crash and pulled out of the classroom shortly thereafter. He addressed the public 25 minutes later before leaving the elementary school and being rushed to Air Force One. He called the attacks a national tragedy and vowed that terrorism against our nation will not stand. Next slide. 9:36 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Secret Service agents evacuate Vice President Dick Cheney to an undisclosed location that we would later learn was the Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the White House. Next slide. 9:37 a.m. Eastern Time, as millions of Americans watched the events unfolding in New York City, another hijacked plane, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the west side of the Pentagon military headquarters. The 53 passengers, 6 crew members, and 5 hijackers were instantly killed. The impact and ensuing fire that led to a structural collapse of a portion of the giant concrete building killed an additional 125 military and civilian personnel on the ground. Next slide. 9:42 a.m. Eastern Time, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered a nationwide ground stop, meaning that all civilian domestic flights within American airspace must land at the nearest airport, and international flights were diverted from American airspace. Next slide. At 9:45 a.m. Eastern Time, evacuations of the White House and the United States Capitol, where the House of Representatives and the Senate were in session, began. Next slide. 9:55 a.m. Eastern Time, Air Force One with President George W. Bush takes off from Florida. At first, they had no definite place that they were going, but they decided on an Air Force base in Florida, or not Florida, in Louisiana, that they were going to land at. They wanted him to be off the ground and not susceptible to any kind of attack. Next slide. At 9:59 a.m., again, as millions and millions of Americans were watching a live broadcast of the burning towers, there was a rumbling, and the South Tower collapsed in a massive cloud of dust and smoke. In 10 seconds, after burning for 56 minutes, the 110-story building just disappeared. Next slide. 10:03 a.m. Eastern Time, a fourth plane that had been hijacked, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a rural field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing instantly the 37 passengers, 7 crew members, and 4 hijackers on board. The flight had been delayed in taking off, so passengers had heard of the previous events and knew once their plane had been hijacked that they would not be landing safely. The passengers planned an attack on the cockpit to force the plane down before it could crash into another building. Its intended target was assumed to be either the U.S. Capitol or the White House. Next slide. 10:28 Eastern Time. After burning for 102 minutes, the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. The iconic skyline of the greatest city in the world was changed forever. Next slide. At 5:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 World Trade Center, a 47-story building, collapsed after fires had started inside the building. Next slide. 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, President George W. Bush addressed the nation from the White House. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. Next slide. September 14th, President George W. Bush visited Ground Zero, the smoking pile of debris of what remained of the World Trade Center and the thousands who had perished there. Standing on top of a wrecked fire truck, Bush grabbed a bullhorn to address the rescue workers working feverishly to find any survivors. When one of the workers said that he could not hear what the president was saying, Bush made one of the most memorable remarks of his presidency. "I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear from all of us soon." Next slide. Overall, 2,750 people were killed in New York City, including 343 New York firefighters. Another 184 were killed in the Pentagon and 40 more in rural Pennsylvania. All 19 terrorists died.
So the first question I have for Karen, and thank you for that history. The first question I have for Karen is about the terrorist organization responsible for the attacks, a group called Al-Qaeda. What were the key factors that led to the rise of Al-Qaeda and the planning of the 9/11 attacks?
Al-Qaeda came out of Afghanistan, and it came out of the Russian invasion, the Soviet, I guess it was, invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Taliban was fighting against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and the Americans actually were supporting the Taliban at that time. There are lots of awkward photos that will become awkward post 9/11 of politicians and American officials giving aid and even weapons to members of the Taliban, who will later become members of Al-Qaeda. So that's the beginning of it. They're fighting against Soviet occupation. And then when eventually the Soviets do leave, there is a different enemy, and that is the West generally, and the United States more specifically. Osama bin Laden, who had been excommunicated, stripped of his citizenship in Saudi Arabia, took leadership of it, and he wanted to bring the death and destruction to the United States. So there were a number of different attacks, including attacking embassies, attacking military facilities in other countries. There's the 1993 bombing in the World Trade Center, where they had a truck bomb go off in the parking garage under the World Trade Center, hoping that it would bring it down, but it did not. And then there was the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen, which killed 17 sailors. And so there had been a consistency in his trying to bring the war to the United States. So it wasn't inconceivable that it could happen.
So my next question is for Vanessa, and there are so many changes that come after 9/11, but I would like to hear your take on some of the changes as it involves the federal government.
Well, I think 9/11 changed all our lives, but it also changed our perception of what the federal government should be doing for us. I think prior to 9/11, and I see a couple of my students in here, we were steaming towards devolution. Federal power was shifting back through the states through a variety of means. 9/11 completely shocks that. And everybody kind of is looking that day for the president. They're not looking for Bailey Hutchinson, Phil Gramm. They're looking for the president to unify us, offer us support, and provide a solution. And that shifting mindset or zeitgeist really created a new idea of what the federal government should do in terms of the balance between liberty versus security. And we really shifted our lens towards they've got to protect us, they have to help us solve problems, and they've got to figure out who the bad guys are. And we saw a litany of laws that were enacted post 9/11 that really codify those shifts. Some of them, obviously, most of us been to the airport. nationalization of the security screeners, TSA. And just even if I worked on the Hill prior to 9/11, you could take the subway underneath from the Dirksen building, from the Senate to, those buildings, and now you cannot. You could walk into the Supreme Court building from the front. Now you can only go in access it from the side. And it really began a series of changes in that sort of balance of power. And I just have to say, I have to apologize. I have to run and leave. I have a dual credit class that I must attend to in about 20 minutes. But it's been wonderful talking about this, and thank you for including me.
So my next question is for Cheryl. Vanessa told us about some of the changes that happened at a governmental level, but I'd like to know a little bit more about how 9/11 changed society. So specifically, what logistical changes have we seen in our society as a result of the 9/11 attacks? And how does U.S. society operate differently in response to the attack?
There have been so many things, and I think a lot of times now, 23 years later, we forget the origin of these things that have become habitual ways of living now. There's some things that have gone away. Like early on, I don't know, some of you guys may remember this, but there was the federal government put out a threat alert system, a threat of terrorism alert system, and it was color coded. Does anybody remember that? Where you would have like red alert days and yellow alert days, and it would be on the news every morning, and it would be based on intelligence that they were getting in about what was the level of threat. And I remember people considering what was the threat level today if they needed to go to the mall or if there was going to be a gathering of people, and you would look at kind of what the threat level is. I think in 2011, they changed that system, and now they don't do the daily alerts, and they would just alert you if there was a problem. But early on, people really keyed to that, which shows you how in tune we were with how fragile our way of life was and the level of threat. Other things, think about like the clear bag policy when you go to a stadium or any kind of a gathering. 9/11 came year and a half, 2 years after Columbine, and so we were already a little bit fragile, and we were already thinking, being in a crowd, we were realizing we could be victimized being in a crowd, and 9/11 just really drove home the impact of that, and we started to realize that anytime we gathered together, we were a target. And so all those clear bag policies, that's kind of where those started originating. The big one I always think about is airport security, and Vanessa mentioned that just briefly, but if you weren't alive before that, I don't think people really realize what an entirely different experience it is going to the airport. If you've seen old movies where you could just walk your friends and family right up to the gate, there wasn't a security stop. You just walked people right up, or if you had to meet somebody at the airport, there wasn't any like texting like crazy and meet me at E5. Okay, never mind, they changed it to B6 or whatever, right? You would just walk right up to the gate and get them as they came off the plane. And so this whole going through the security scanners, and you can't bring liquids, and you have to take off your shoes and your belt. It's interesting, that all came because of the 9/11 attacks, understandably, but it's also interesting how, as a result of that, our kind of ideas of what freedom means to us have changed. Because before 9/11, we wouldn't have let anyone tell us to take off our belt or our shoes. We would have been like, what are you talking about? I'm an American, I have rights. In the name of my freedoms, I have the freedom to not take off my belt and my shoes, right? And our whole mindset about that and what freedom meant kind of changed as a result. Now we think, sure, I'll throw away my bottled water, I'll take off my belt, my shoes, go through the scanner in the name of protecting my freedoms, right? A little bit a nod to what Vanessa was talking about the role of our government in our minds changed. We see them differently as a result of 9/11.
All right, so my next question is for Dawn, and we've referenced the trauma that people felt on that day and after that day, not just, of course, the people who were directly affected, but Americans watching TV that day were traumatized because they saw in real time the terror that was happening. So my question for you is, what role did support systems such as counseling services, community groups, or religious organizations play in the healing process, and have those support systems increased due to events like 9/11?
So what we have to realize is that there was not as big of a societal awareness of post-traumatic stress until that point. After that, we realized that first responders experienced extreme stress, and so psychological first aid became pretty big in the form of crisis intervention. And so now we as a society, when a traumatic event happens, we have crisis intervention specialists that are almost always on the scene to help with those types of events. Another thing that happened is that there were interfaith initiatives, and this kind of helped the divisive narrative that was going on, because those interfaith initiatives helped to support communities to heal and to come together and work with one another. So those things had not been happening as frequently until we saw a major shift in, we're going to become one nation and really support each other through this tragic event. Another thing that we realized is that the government said we've got to put more funding into mental health research, and so FEMA actually created funding specifically to help those first responders with the trauma that they experienced and their families. So we see lifelines that kind of changed and became more prominent, and now we actually benefit from that. We may not even realize that, but first responders receive much more attention when it comes to traumatic events. And we also know now that with these crises that society has recognized there needs to be more mental health awareness. The stigma for trauma has become more reduced more than it was before. We have a long way to go, I will say that, but we see a significant change due to such a big event in this society that impacted so many people. Because you think about it, there were people that had family members in New York that were working in the World Trade Centers. There were first responders that came from all over the nation to go support those in New York that had experienced this traumatic event. And when that happened, we came together, and the need for mental health and understanding what trauma does to a nation, to people, to everyone that's involved, it really became more significant in our minds. And so therefore now, when we talk about traumatic stress, when we talk about vicarious trauma, we recognize that it's not just those that are there that experience it, but it's also those that witness it, viewing it over and over and over and over on television, hearing about it over and over and over, because I don't know about you guys, but for the first few weeks, that's all we heard over and over. And there were people that were impacted that weren't even there that experienced that trauma, and so that crisis intervention became very pronounced at that time.
Thank you for that answer. And yeah, I mean, I was sitting in Texas watching the TV, but I was watching people jump from the building.
Exactly.
So yes, even people at home were traumatized. So my next question is for Karen. We're talking about changes that we see post 9/11. So my question specifically is, how did 9/11 create policies with sustaining influence in the United States, but also how did the events of 9/11 influence international relations and alliances?
Within the United States, we had a lot of change, and it all addresses, I know there's a question later on about the security versus freedom balance, and people in times of crisis really tend to, the pendulum swings a lot farther towards security and are much more willing to give up freedoms. And you saw that after 9/11 with the things at the airport taking place, but also the Patriot Act, which was passed pretty quickly, which allowed intelligence agencies to listen in on conversations on telephones and all of this, and the evidence needed to tap somebody or anything like that was much smaller than it had been prior to that. And there were a lot of like your civil liberties union and so forth that were, like, wait, we're giving up too much of our freedom. We are still the United States. We do still have individual rights and privacy and that kind of thing. So there's definitely a balancing act. As far as internationally, it is something that is often repeated, but I think that it is important that the United States has been a member of NATO, NATO being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, since 1949, and since 1949, NATO, a mutual defense alliance that has a section in there that says an attack on one is an attack on all. That has never been put into place except for 9/11, when every NATO nation came to the defense of the United States because we had been attacked. So it strengthened a lot of those alliances. And then when the United States then decided to take the war on terror to Afghanistan, a lot of those NATO allies came with the United States. And so it strengthened a lot of alliances. It ended up being a 20-some year war, and by the end of it, a lot of the allies had left and said, okay, tapped out of it. But from the very beginning, the alliances that the United States had held strong, and they stepped forward to defend the United States when we were under attack.
Angela, my next question is for you. So how did 9/11 contribute to an increase in anxiety and trauma-related symptoms among the general public, and how has this manifested in the years following the attack?
So, as many have mentioned, there were new governmental agencies basically created during this time. I don't know if you realize it, but the Department of Homeland Security was actually created during that time. So we did not have that. What that speaks to is that there was this low-grade anxiety among everybody, and it has continued throughout the years because there's this culture of fear that began because of this attack. And so you would go into an airport, and as Cheryl mentioned, you could walk up to your loved one's flight, meet them at the door. And now that's just beyond our comprehension. And if anyone does that, what do you instantly think? Your mind is automatically going to, what are they doing? They're not supposed to be back here. If you see someone overrun security or go past it, your first thought is, what are they doing? That's that low-grade anxiety that has continued throughout the years because it didn't exist before this. We didn't have that fear of, could someone get on a plane with me and this be the end of not just my life but other people's? And that was something that's significant for us to understand. This culture of fear that we had that was created at that point really created more problems for us than we realized because it created safety, but it also made us afraid to travel at times. The only other time I remember in history of my life that we kind of shut down airlines and things like that is COVID. So that you can relate to that. You remember how travel kind of stopped and your vacations kind of came to an end. All of those things stopped. Well, imagine that you're traveling, you have big plans for your birthday. You're going, say, to San Diego. You plan to go to New York to celebrate. That didn't happen. Things changed, and so everyone had this fear of, if I get on a plane, will this be my last time? If I say goodbye to my loved one, will this be the last time? And then we saw air travel go down as well because of that underlying fear, and people started driving more. So just imagine all of these things because of one tragic event, these government agencies being created, these new safety measures, and when those aren't in place, guess what happens? Our anxiety level goes up. If you walked up to the airport today and security's not there and everybody's just walking on, chances are you're going to have second thoughts about getting on those airplanes because of what we've experienced historically.
So, as a historian, one of the things that we look at as a source are personal accounts of people who lived through events. And so my next question for Karen has something to do with that. How have the narratives of 9/11 survivors and victims' families contributed to our understanding of the events?
Well, I think that personalizing stories is very important in the telling of history as a whole. If you can, I studied oral history at school when I got my PhD, and have done a number, dozens, hundreds of oral history interviews in my career, and every time that you hear someone's story, it actually becomes part of you, and so I think it's very important to hear the different points of view, the different places, the different ways that people experience this event, for you to have a more three-dimensional kind of picture of what happened. And so the telling of survivor stories, the telling of people who were injured, or people who lost loved ones or whatever during that day, is so vitally important, because it gives you a clearer idea of how deeply it affected everyone's lives. So I love that we started off by saying, what our own experience of that day, of that moment was, because it is going to give us a fuller picture of the events and how it affected not just those people in New York, but all of us who were sitting at home watching, or in my case, wishing that they were sitting at home and watching.
Sure. So, one of the things that I love talking about in my own history classes is how an event affects people so much that they are going to express it in different ways. One of the ways they can express it is through art, or music, or movies, or books. So my next question is for Cheryl. How do we see the 9/11 attacks reflected in trends in pop culture? What are some long-term social effects that have developed over the past 23 years that have origins tracing back to the 9/11 attack?
Okay, if you look at, kind of jumping off of what Karen was saying, and we process our world through stories a lot of times, like so many big events that happen, there are a rash of songs, movies, literature, art that came out of this one 9/11 event. Almost immediately, the "I'm Proud to Be an American" song, who is that, Lee Greenwood?
Yes.
Is that Lee Greenwood? Yes. Came out and was played constantly over the airways. Movies both about the actual attack and the aftermath. There have been so many of those. Art, the street artist Banksy, do you guys know who that is? Came really into popularity he does protest street art and political commentary street art, and so he kind of really came into the forefront. There was a big rise in dystopian literature. Do you guys know what I'm talking about when I say dystopian? And so, and shows, things like Black Mirror, all came about post 9/11. And like tends to happen, maybe unfortunately, a lot of the times, there are so many conspiracy theories that have come out about 9/11. They tend to sort of have a theme that either the government knew and didn't stop it, or was complicit, our government, or was complicit in the attacks, or even some of the extreme conspiracy theories talk about that the U.S. government was really behind the attacks, and they cite things as evidence, like building materials that were found in the rubble, or things that happened in the stock market that seemed to indicate that somebody had prior knowledge, like change in trading in stocks for airlines and insurance companies. The federal government has investigated all of those charges thoroughly. They're unfounded, but like conspiracy theories do, they tend to linger. As far as the second part of your question about some long-term social effects, there's been a lot of conversation about the 9/11 attacks marked a turn in the us versus us mentality, where we were afraid of things like the Columbine shooting, right, where we were keeping an eye on each other and violent crime within our own society and being attacked by other Americans. We'd had a couple of years before Columbine, the Oklahoma City bombing, for example, which was an example of domestic terrorism. And so we were seeing people at home as a threat, and 9/11 kind of turned us over to a us versus them mentality, where it was attack from outside that we were worried about. Prior to that, we saw ourselves as a little bit invincible. We had the most powerful military in the world and didn't worry too much about attacks from the outside. And so that changed with 9/11, and we felt vulnerable on the worldwide stage. We, right after 9/11, had a huge surge in patriotic feeling. Patriotism was probably at an all-time high. I, in my lifetime, have never seen patriotism at a fever pitch like it was immediately following 9/11, which was a good thing, and people united and were supportive of each other. And it wasn't too long before that quickly gave way to the negative side of that, which was like racially profiling people who we viewed as the other, or who we maybe saw as outsiders in one way or another. And it's interesting to me, just from a sociological standpoint, how those two things are connected, how that unity of Americans we can see as such a good thing in terms of patriotism, and how quickly we turn that unity into saying, well, who are we not united with, right? And finger pointing. And not that we hadn't had racial or ethnic prejudices in our country from time to time prior to that, but 9/11 almost made it politically correct or acceptable to have those views for a short period of time.
So, in talking about the long-term effects of 9/11, Angela, I'd like to ask what your thoughts are about the long-term psychological effects on people who witnessed these kinds of attacks or experienced them through media coverage. I know we've talked about the trauma of just watching on TV, but what are the long-term effects of that?
So what I'll speak to with that is that if you can each think about something that's happened in your life that maybe wasn't a positive event, it was one that it hurt you a little bit, even just a little bit. The anniversary of those events, we remember with rich detail. And your body keeps the score. There's actually a book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's about trauma. And your body holds on to that. So when each one of us were telling our memories, I could almost guarantee that somebody had a heightened sense in their body of that feeling, that breathless feeling, the heart rate being raised. Those things happen. And so long term, that's still there. It's 23 years later, and it's still there. I could feel it when I was talking about it. Now you think about you, something that you experienced that was traumatic, and the anniversary of that event, it's in your head. As Dr. Clayton was talking about it, as both Dr. Reed and Dr. Wisely were talking about it, Cheryl, Vanessa, each one of us, there was something in our body that we could feel, because that's that anniversary and it marks it. That's a long-term psychological effect. So each one of us that experienced something, when we have an anniversary of that event, you may even forget the date, but there's something that's going to happen in your body. And you'll start going, what's going on? I feel kind of off. And then all of a sudden, it will come to you, oh, wow, it's that anniversary again. That psychological effect is long-term, and we can't dismiss that. That's really what happens to us. So when we recognize that, we have to go, this is what I'm feeling. This is why I'm feeling it. And remind ourselves, I'm here now. It's 2024. I'm not there. Start those grounding practices, some deep breathing to make sure you bring yourself back to this present moment. Because though that anniversary is there, it's not going to control you if you take control and you say, I'm going to do some grounding exercises. I'm going to bring myself back. I recognize what's going on, and I'm in 2024. This is Wednesday. I'm at Tarrant County College. You know, you bring yourself back to where you need to be. Those long-term psychological effects are powerful, but we also can learn skills to overcome those.
Excuse me, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I remember on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, my husband and I sat down and watched a documentary, and I felt everything that I felt on that day just watching that documentary, and I wasn't prepared for that at all. So I love that you mentioned that. Karen, my next question is for you. How do historians ensure that the memory of 9/11 is preserved accurately for future generations? And what are some of the memorials that we see?
Well, the biggest memorial obviously is the new World Trade Center in New York City, and the museum and the memorial surrounding that. I haven't been there yet. Someday. My colleague Chloe Northrup has and sent me photos of it. So that's a big one. There's also one at the Pentagon. There's also one in the field in Pennsylvania where that plane crashed. And they are probably having wreath laying ceremonies today at those sites. There's a reading of the names of the victims that happens at the 9/11 Memorial in New York City. I know that. But all around the country, there are other memorials. There are where firefighters and other first responders went to New York to participate in undoing the big pile of debris. Some of them brought back, steel girders or something, and that has become part of a memorial. They do the firefighter, what is it, where they run up the stairs with the hose and everything. That seems terrible to me, but it's something that they do in memory of those guys running up the stairs into the fire instead of away from it. And they have 5K runs and things like that all over the country in honor of that as well. What we can do as historians to make sure that it is remembered correctly is by teaching it, and that is part of the reason that we're here today. Is that sometimes towards the end of the semester we don't always get into as much depth of the later events as we do at the beginning, and we wanted to make sure that we have the availability, and this being recorded will help that, so that you can go back and you can look and understand what happened, and we want to make sure that it is accurate, that you are getting a lot of different points of view, and just ask other people. It is. I ask my classes every year, how many of you were born when 9/11 happened, and there are fewer and fewer of you every year, which really makes me feel old. But I think that makes it more important that we tell you about it, and I know that it's difficult sometimes for us to talk about it because of the trauma that Angela was talking about, and. But ask your family members, ask your mom and dad, do you remember where you were on 9/11, and hear their stories, and all of that will help you put things in perspective and maybe understand it a little bit better, I would think.
Speaking of younger generations who don't necessarily have those experiences, Angela, this question is specifically for you, but actually I want to open it up. I'll let you talk first, but I want to open it up to Cheryl and Karen as well. How do you think the trauma of 9/11 has affected younger generations who were not directly involved or who were born after the event?
So at this point, I'd like to address intergenerational effects of trauma. There are a lot of studies on epigenetics, and basically that's your inherited experiences from your parents and those from generations back. It's like this: we have the DNA and it has the letters. Doesn't mean it changes the letters, it just changes how those letters are modified or are monitored. So it's like if you were to type out the word fear in your text, lowercase, not so bad, but if you type fear in caps, what does that mean? You're feeling some serious fear there, you're screaming. That's how it's worded, or how it's spoken. So when we do it in a lowercase, it's totally different than when it's in caps. Well, our DNA holds on to some experiences of our family, and those experiences do shape us whether we realize it or not. So that gives us a lot of understanding of us not just being nature, but we're also nurture, so all of it comes together at that point. And so it affects you too. There's a ripple effect when a major traumatic event occurs. There is a ripple effect that carries on from generation to generation if there is not help that's received. And again, you probably feel some of this as well, not just because of the stories you've heard, but if you were actually, your mother was carrying you at that time, and many of you, that was probably the case. Just like Cheryl mentioned, she just had her her son. Your mother experienced that trauma in her body. That means the letters of your DNA probably went from lowercase to caps at that point. It's experiences that shape us. And it shapes how we have an overactive stress response or an underactive one. It shapes a lot of things, and we want to realize that that ripple effect of that overactive stress response is still with us until we address it, and we're able to move past that and to readdress it again and again if it comes up. So it's just pretty powerful when you think about intergenerational trauma. It's real, and we know that more now than ever before.
Cheryl?
To piggyback on that, I think it's interesting to think about the cumulative effects of events and of anxiety and how our society operates differently because of it. We're much more fear-driven as a society than I think we realize. The way we do things has changed, like parenting, for example. I remember being a little kid and leaving after breakfast in the summer and riding my bike all over town, and we were down in the creek and at the park and wandering off to the general store, and who had change for a candy bar, and when it was dark was when we were supposed to be home. Parents today, their kids have to stay in their own yard, right? And it's just our whole society has shifted in that very much more cautious, much more anxiety-driven, fear-driven ways that we approach things. Whether that's good or bad, our laws have even shifted. I read something about a parent getting arrested because they let their kids walk to the park after school and nobody was supervising them, and so that was neglectful parenting. So our policies have changed as a result of that, and I think that does carry on generation to generation.
Karen?
I think that the way that trauma affects the trauma of that day and of other events affects generations that were not yet born. I mean, yes, there's the DNA, yes, there's the changes in society, but there's also the assumption that you guys know what we're talking about when we talk about 9/11, right? And for a lot of you folks who weren't born then or don't really know about it or never learned about it, you tend to say, yeah, oh yeah, we know. Because you've heard about it somewhere. Not in depth, but we're saying, yeah, you know what it is, because we don't want to talk about it because that brings up our own trauma. And you're saying, yeah, we know what it is because you don't really want to ask us about it because you know it's going to bring up our trauma. And so it's something that doesn't get talked about enough. And And so that's why I'm encouraging you to ask your parents, ask your older siblings, ask your aunts and uncles, grandparents, whatever, what their experience was. Like I did that with my mom about JFK, the JFK assassination, and it is one of those temporal landmarks that everyone knows where they were and what they were doing when it happened. And so it's something that you can learn about, but we don't often learn about it because we want to kind of let it go. Let's not ask them about that. They might cry. What if they cry? Oh my gosh, wouldn't that be terrible? And no, it isn't. Crying is fine, It serves a purpose. So I encourage you to talk with your family members. I encourage you to learn more about it. There are tons of documentaries out there. They're on, HBO Max, Netflix. We got a whole bunch of them on our library website, the PBS library, the PBS video collection in the library website has a whole bunch of them. There's some movies on Swank Digital Campus. If you wanna learn more about it, come and talk to us, and I can recommend a lot of things that you can watch.
Thank you to our panelists, but now we'd like to hear from you. So what questions do you have for us? Oh, wait for the microphone, yeah, so we can hear you. Thank you.
Hey, you got it? Okay.
It's for Dr. Wisely. So you say that the United States helped Al-Qaeda with, giving them weapons and resources and whatnot, but why did they have a change of heart?
Well, it wasn't Al-Qaeda yet. That happened when the Soviets left Afghanistan, is Al-Qaeda was formed. But it formed out of the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan when the Soviets had invaded. And the change of heart was because the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, and it was the height or the depth, however you want to look at it, of the Cold War. And basically, if the Soviets did anything, we were dead set against it. And they invaded Afghanistan. Well, now we have to help the Afghanis to overthrow this Soviet rule. And so we were willing to do whatever it took to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And that meant, and unfortunately, allying with some folks that were, maybe not the greatest. Sure. And we did that a lot during the Cold War, so I hope it doesn't concern anybody here.
It's like the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes.
That's exactly what that was
Yeah,
during the Cold
yeah,
War.
and the Truman Doctrine is like, we will support all free peoples, and what he meant by free peoples were people who weren't communists, and that is the only thing that mattered. If you weren't communist, you were fighting against communists, we're going to be there for you.
Anybody else have a question?
So I guess you talked about this. You talked about this a little bit, but just touching a little bit more on the ramifications of 9/11 on foreign policy, and especially the now debunked lies about WMDs in Iraq, for example, and everything else that happened, and the war on terror that basically happened after that. What do you think the ramifications of that are? And anyone who I guess wants to answer, but what do you think the ramifications of the war on terror are? And do you think the supposed war on terror has ended now with us pulling out of Afghanistan, or is there anything still going on, I guess, is my question.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's a big question.
It is a great question, and I kind of want to punt it by saying that as historians, we don't really start looking at things until 25 years later. So we just got out of Afghanistan, so it's going to be 25 years before we know any of this. But that is the punt answer. The genuine answer is that, I mean, there are things that we still don't know. But would I say that the war on terror is over? I would probably say no. There is still a lot of, things, intelligence agencies working on this. There's still, we still have soldiers all over in these places, maybe not in the numbers that we did during the, the Afghanistan war and the Iraqi war, but there are still U.S. soldiers all over the place. They are, special forces, are available to get there within hours of anything happening. They can, and so it's not like we've completely become isolationist and all of that. We still have our fingers involved in a lot in those areas. Ma'am.
I just want to add to what you're saying, is that military objectives always change. So the objectives that would have been there when the war on terror started merge into something much bigger. Right. So it's not quite the same, which is part of why it's ongoing. And they change mid-war. Yeah. Right.
And to go along with something that Karen said, like, we aren't going to know quite what the effects are for quite some time. But we know that there are going to be effects because that was a 20-year war. Yeah. So there are definitely going to be consequences. We're just not sure exactly what those are going to be yet. But that was
because they don't release documents. That's why.
Right.
We don't have access to them.
And also because, I mean, and this was like something that was always being talked about in the news and so forth. But every time that the United States bombs a place in Afghanistan, there are bystanders or somebody who were then radicalized because you killed my family. And we don't know what's going to happen with that. We don't know when or if that might come back to roost. So, it's a long-term thing. We'll be studying this for decades.
Well, and additionally, we made policy changes post 9/11 that allowed us to deal with any ongoing threat of terrorism differently, like the Patriot Act changed the warrant requirements to search things, so it made a lot of data more available to the justice system on possible threats. It allowed the U.S. government to detain what they call them unlawful combatants until the end of the hostilities, which is, when is that, the end of the hostilities? And without having been convicted or sometimes even formally charged with anything, which is a very, non-traditional way for the American government to operate. So we have a lot of kind of ongoing fallout in that way that continues because those laws and those policies were changed.
So it's the suspension, by the way, of habeas corpus. So definitely ask about that in your government classes.
Yeah. And there's also the, giving the president the power to implement the military at his disposal without having to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. Yeah. That is pretty huge too.
And we've seen that before in history. That's how the Vietnam War was fought. But there was a swing the other direction post-Vietnam to kind of take those powers away. We saw it swing back the other direction with 9/11.
Yeah.
Great questions. Any others? Yes.
It's not a question, but can we
Hold
talk
on,
about
hold on.
can we talk about freedom fries?
Oh.
That's culture.
That is culture. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah,
there
can we
was-
mention freedom fries and
Yeah.
the context behind them?
There was a brief moment.
Hey.
We call them French fries.
Can we time out for just a second and remind
yes.
them to?
Yeah, before you leave, please
fill out the evaluation form that's on your
click that
on that
do
QR
that
code.
QR code.
And it says at the top evaluation. There's one for checking in and there's one for evaluation.
It's on the back.
Flip that page
Yeah.
over and fill out that evaluation.
Yeah.
That would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
So, yes, brief moment where the French weren't as supportive of the war in Iraq.
Yeah, that was the
And
Iraqi
so
war. They
that
were
was the Iraqi
supportive
war, yeah.
in Afghanistan.
So there was this backlash against anything French, and quite frankly, throughout American history, there's been this sort of love-hate relationship with the French. But this is one of those moments that that's unpatriotic, and so we changed anything French to freedom, so it's freedom fries. That did not stick. So, yeah, although I'm sure the Belgians were pretty happy about that. Because they claim to have invented the fry, so they don't like to hear it called French fry because they're like, no, it's from Belgium, it's not from France. But yeah,
They have their waffles.
they do have waffles and chocolate,
Yes.
all of that good stuff. Yeah, so freedom fries. We see that in other moments in history too. So, for instance, during World War I, U.S. involvement in World War I, anything German, because we were fighting against Germany, anything German was bad. And so they changed, it's my favorite, they changed the name of the German measles, which is actually a terrible disease, to the Liberty measles, because that was going to make it better, right?
Or the House of Windsor.
Yeah, oh gosh, yes. Yeah, they changed their name too, because it was Saxe-Coburg. Like, that's German, we can't do that. So the British royal family changed their name, so, yeah.
Oh, the
That's great.
Liberty measles, that's great. Yes.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. There's probably some extra pizza in the back, so if you want a slice on the way out, feel free to go get it. Otherwise, enjoy your day.